The following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association.
Welcome to You and the Law. I'm Mike Monta, your producer and host for tonight's program. And our topic tonight is going to deal with the impact of federal law on due process and our community. Joining me as very special guests on tonight's show, the Honorable Walter H. Rice, Chief Judge for the United States District Court, Southern Division, Western Division, something like that here in Ohio, and the Honorable Michael R. Merz, Magistrate Judge, also for the United States District Court here in Dayton, Ohio. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, the status of the death penalty, re-entry programs for offenders, separation of powers, and whatever you, the viewing audience, might call in about. Before we get to a discussion of these issues, let me remind you that You and the Law is a monthly presentation produced here at the studios of the Dayton Access Television. DATV on Channel 5 is the public access channel of now Spectrum, I understand, cable network in Dayton. And the program is also cablecast on tape delay via the auspices of the Miami Valley Cable Council. We also stream live at datv.org. Our telephone number, as you see on the banner, is 223-5311. I believe we also telecast live on Channel 6 in our suburbs on the Spectrum network. So let me, one more thing, as you saw at the beginning, we are sponsored proudly by the Dayton Bar Association, whose director is Bill Wheeler. Hope Bill's feeling good and watching tonight. So let me, without further ado, let me ask our guests to introduce themselves more fully to you and tell you a bit about their background and familiarity with tonight's topic. And we'll turn first to Judge Merz. Good evening, Judge Merz.
So as Michael said, I'm Michael Merz. I've been a Daytonian all my life, went away to law school and then came home and to keep up the family rep as a fifth generation Daytonian. Very pleased about that. Practiced law here at Dayton for a little over 6 years and then became a judge of the Dayton Municipal Court where I was for a little over 7 years before Judge Rice spirited me away to federal court back in 1984.
Best thing I ever did.
I think you're right. And thank you, Judge Merz. And Judge Rice, good evening to you.
Good evening, sir.
And?
Well, I am not Michael Merz. I'm Walter Rice, and I've been very fortunate to have been a judge in this community. I'm now in my 48th year. Spent a year or two in the Dayton Municipal Court, some 9 years in the Court of Common Pleas. And I've been in federal court now. It'll be 37 years in a few weeks.
And you were an appointee of
President
James
Carter.
Earl Carter.
Right.
All right.
Best thing President Carter ever did.
One of the great things.
Thank you.
So it's great to have you both here. Let me start by talking about one of the items that you, Judge Merz, are deeply involved in, and that's the status of the death penalty situation. And you have been instrumental in writing opinions which are guiding the status of the situation right now. So can you give us a little overview, maybe a background of death penalty, how it's gotten to where it is today?
the death penalty was reinstated in Ohio, current statute in 1980, and Ohio began convicting people and putting them on death row within a couple of years after that. I became involved in 1995, the first case that we had here in Dayton, where a death row inmate was saying what you have to say to come to federal court, that my conviction violates the United States Constitution.
Now, your involvement is after convictions, correct?
Absolutely.
In what's
Right.
known as the habeas corpus
Right.
portion of the case. You don't try the cases as
No.
death penalty cases, and later we'll ask Judge Rice about that starting point.
Habeas corpus has been most of my work with death penalty, but then there's another side to it. If you allege that the method of execution is cruel and unusual, the method of execution violates a constitutional right, then you can bring a civil rights case about that. And we've had civil rights cases challenging the method of execution since the Supreme Court approved doing that in 2004. And I wasn't involved with that side of it until about a year ago when the judge who'd been handling that case retired.
And why do we care? Not us in particular, but the public. Why do we care about the methodology of executions?
Well, the Eighth Amendment says we cannot execute somebody, or indeed deal with them otherwise, by cruel and unusual punishment. And it's very clear that the founders had in mind no more hanging, drawing, and quartering, no torture, no burning at the stake. Justice Scalia was even willing to say no crucifixion. That's very clearly what the founders had in mind. But in the late 50s, the Supreme Court said that cruel and unusual punishment has to be gauged by the mores, the culture, at the time the punishment is imposed. So we've had lots of litigation about whether methods of execution violate current community norms.
You know, presently, we are awaiting a decision or ruling in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals based upon a decision which you wrote within the past couple months concerning some of the drugs involved with the executions.
Right. The current Ohio lethal injection method, or protocol as the state calls it, calls for using any one of three varieties of drugs. The one that the state is currently proposing to use involves 3 drugs, and the case that I have is focused on the first of those drugs, a sedative called midazolam, or I think the brand name is Versed, commonly used as the first stage of inducing general anesthesia. The amount that the state proposes to use in these cases is a great deal, hundreds of times the therapeutic dose, the dose that the hospitals would use. And that therein lies the nub. Does that method create a substantial or significant risk of severe pain? And that's what we had to decide in January.
Okay. Judge Rice, your involvement with the death penalty would be on the trial side. Do we have many cases here in our district federally involved with that?
There are very, very few federal death penalty cases because very few federal crimes are punished by the death penalty. I think there have been 1, maybe 2 in the 37 years I've been on federal court bench, and they were both in Columbus. So I haven't had a death penalty case, Michael, since I was in common pleas 36, 37 years ago. And while this goes beyond the scope of your question, while recognizing Judge Merz as an expert in this area, he and I often talk about the future of the death penalty. And I truly feel that within 10 or 15 years, it will be no longer with us. Not necessarily on moral grounds, but on the grounds that we cannot apply it on a non-discriminatory basis in an expeditious manner. And when I say non-discriminatory, I mean a racially neutral manner. We cannot apply it to across the socioeconomic strata. Death penalty cases seem to impact more minorities and more people lower on that socioeconomic scale, which I think is intolerable. Secondly, when I say expeditious manner, we have people on death row 20, 25 years or more. I certainly don't advocate a rush to judgment where the death penalty is involved, but if we're going to keep the death penalty, we need to do it in such a way as to preserve all of the due process safeguards while at the same time not extending it to a point in time where it A, has absolutely no deterrent effect, and B, doesn't give the families of the victim any chance at closure, many times within their lifetime. And more states are either doing away with the death penalty, or in the case of a state like California, it's still on the books, but I don't believe they've executed anyone in the last 20 years. So it is falling into disuse, even where it is still legal.
Do you think it's notable that there's been fewer death penalty verdicts, at least in Ohio, since they went to life without parole?
Absolutely. Jurors, not only in Ohio, but jurors generally, are known to go with the death penalty when they don't have life without parole as a possibility, because of the fear that somebody will get out and murder again. So the number of convictions and death sentences in Ohio since we adopted the possibility of life without parole has gone down, I would say, precipitately.
And I would agree with that, and I think this is reflected in the number of death penalty eligible cases brought by prosecutors across the state of Ohio. Often, if a person is indicted with what we call death penalty specifications, making that person eligible for the death penalty, the prosecutors would be willing to accept a plea of guilty with the penalty of life without parole, rather than going through, frankly, the lengthy process of trying and then defending a death penalty verdict. There's another reason why I think the death penalty is doomed. There are counties in Ohio that simply cannot afford to bring a death penalty case because of the incredibly high cost. And if you commit a homicide that should make you death penalty eligible in one of those many counties, you simply have escaped the potential of a death penalty. Whereas if you commit such a crime in one of the urban centers, the death penalty prosecution is far more likely. Simply another reason why, at least I feel, the death penalty will soon be a relic of the past.
People who adhere to the wanting to have the death penalty reflect on cases like the one in the South where the young man shot the people in the church and had his trial, represented himself, was found guilty and received the death penalty. So proponents are going to say, what do we do with a case like that, which it seems like that person shouldn't have the right to live on. So shouldn't the punishment be the ultimate punishment? And of course, some people would like to even have more suffering to it.
Right.
So how do we get from where we are now to a point where you'd have everybody agreeing, let's not do it at all?
I don't want to monopolize this, Judge. Let me hear your opinion, then I'll respond.
Well, I think one important change, particularly to address the geographic disparity that Judge Rice just mentioned, would be to have the Attorney General have to approve, the Attorney General of the state have to approve indicting on a capital basis. We already have that at the federal level. There can be no federal death penalty prosecution without individual approval of the Attorney General. The other thing is, I think if the statutes were revised to limit death penalty to these really hellacious cases, the case
Like
you
the
just,
one I just talked
yeah,
about. Right.
or the marathon bombing in Massachusetts.
Right.
I think juries would be more willing to impose the penalty than they are if there were that kind of limitation. True multiple murder terrorist attacks, but that's not the way the statute reads now. I've had cases where, horrible as they are, the crime was a convenience store death in a robbery that went awry. And in those cases, the juries don't return the verdict, or the courts we don't see the outrage over the crime, and therefore the process gets slowed down.
If there is a reason for the death penalty, then certainly the 9 killings in South Carolina, the Boston Marathon bombing, certainly these would qualify as hellacious, however that term is ultimately defined.
Timothy McVeigh.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. But Michael, the way the death penalty is carried out today, I can't think of anything more horrible than a sentence of life without parole. Knowing that you're never going to see daylight as a free man or woman again, which also gives the family whatever closure can be gotten in a situation like that so they can go on with their lives. I think that is far more of a punishment, if I can use that term, than knowing, hey, I've been given the death penalty, but I'm going to go on living for another 25 or 30 years and probably will never be executed.
It's been said that the prosecutor's argument is that if you eliminate the death penalty, then there's no more plea bargaining room, and because they know they're not going to get executed. In other words, if it's held over the person's head, then they'll likely bargain down into the life categories. Is that a valid argument, do you think?
Go ahead, please.
I think it's inappropriate to indict capitally with a sense of using that as a bargaining chip. I've never been a prosecutor, but it doesn't strike me as fair. Some prosecutors do that,
Right.
but it's execution is, in my judgment, too severe a thing to use for that.
I could not agree more. And I want to emphasize that in our county, while we have a prosecutor who has never proclaimed to be soft on crime, there are probably fewer death penalty prosecutions in Montgomery County than in any large urban county in the state, because he does not bring death penalty eligible cases willy-nilly, as they do in so many counties of the state where the death penalty is used as a bargaining chip. His death penalty prosecutions are reviewed by a panel. In effect, he does not bring death penalty cases unless they are of the, using your term, hellacious character. I agree with Judge Merz. There's something immoral about threatening death, knowing you're using it only as a plea bargaining chip.
Well, I'm thinking, based on the approach you've had here, and it's not just here, it's a lifelong thing, that it probably says more about us as a society not to execute the worst of the worst people for the worst of the worst crimes than it is to take vengeance, an eye for an eye.
I think
Would that be a fair statement?
I think that's a valid statement. I also think the public is beginning to realize that if you have hypothetically half the people or 60% of the people on death row comprising a demographic that's only 10 to 12% of the population, that there is simply something wrong with how the death penalty is applied, how it's carried out, and the like. So I think it's, yes, compassion. Not compassion in the sense of I feel sorry for the man who committed mass murder, but just compassion as a human being generally. I also think it's a growing abhorrence as to upon whom the death penalty falls disproportionately.
Yeah, and certainly there's no solace for victims and families of victims who've lost a loved one, whether it's a convenience store murder or a Boston bombing or a church murder.
I don't. Please.
No, I was going to say it's, and I sort of feel bad for prosecutors who have to say, look, maybe it's better that we do a life without parole, save everybody more grief than they need to, because as you alluded before, even after a conviction, whether it be life without parole, some other life, or death, it's still not going to be a satisfactory ending for those who have lost their loved ones.
There are very few of the cases that I have had where, you know, if you were a citizen who came upon the scene with a weapon and you could prevent the crime from being carried out, a rape of a child, for example, rape and murder of a child, you could prevent that crime from being carried out by applying a deadly force to the perpetrator. I don't think there are very many people who would, with most of the cases that I've had, who would say, no, I don't think that's justified. But the question is, apply deadly force 20 to 25 years later, after we've spent millions of dollars. A lot of people don't realize how much more money we spend on an execution than we do on somebody doing life without parole.
I don't want to, and your facts are absolutely correct, but I don't want to talk about it in terms of finances beyond what I've already mentioned. It's like punishing your child. If your child does something wrong, the time to impose discipline is at or very shortly after it occurs, not the next week, when the child basically has forgotten what prompted the discipline in the first place. I want to mention one other thing. Our justice system, which I love and which both of us, including you, Michael, in addition to you, have spent our whole lives working with, trying to improve, is not perfect. The number of death row exonerations in this country in the last 10 years with DNA evidence and technology leads me to believe that statistically it is absolutely impossible for us not to have executed innocent people.
Absolutely.
And this concerns me very, very much.
This is one where I think we disagree. I've had a lot of cases where the habeas petitioner said, I'm actually innocent. If you'll just give me one more DNA test, I'll prove that I'm innocent. And I've always found a way to do that. And both 2 or 3 times that that's happened, the person has come back more guilty than when they started. The DNA has...
Everybody feels better about the execution.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that the I once offered a law school class an automatic A if somebody could give me a paper that showed that we had executed an innocent person sometime since the penalty was reinstated in 1976, and nobody got the prize.
I revere my colleague, but I disagree
He's
with
just
him
wrong,
on this.
isn't he?
He has a different, it's counterfactual. These are fake news, but I don't, of course I don't mean that, but let me say this. To say we have never executed an innocent person out of the thousands we have executed in this country since we became remotely civilized, I believe, I'll say erroneous, to the point of, if he weren't my revered colleague, I would accuse him of aggravated naivete, but I won't do that.
Do you think that...
Sorry about that.
Do you think that perhaps in law enforcement, when these charges are being made in which the ultimate penalty may be involved, that maybe the DNA test at the beginning of the process may aid the resolution later on, so the people don't have to come back 15 years later saying, you know, why wasn't I given a DNA test? Just to be absolutely sure.
Well, there's a twist on that that's important. Some of the cases that we have stay on death row so long that there was DNA testing at the beginning, but the DNA testing protocols have become much more sophisticated.
Right.
So most of the guys I've have had DNA at the outset, and they've come back saying, well, the testing's better now, and if you test it again, it would exonerate me.
Okay.
When I first came to practice shortly after the Civil War, Michael, if a prosecutor, and I did spend a few years in the prosecutor's office, had eyewitness testimony, the case was considered a slam dunk for the prosecution because eyewitness testimony in those days was seen as the be-all and end-all. That has
Positive.
dispositive,
Yeah.
totally. That has totally flipped to the point where scientific studies, years of experience have shown us that in many cases that is the least reliable evidence, and that a strong circumstantial evidence case is far better for the prosecution. So cases, many death penalty cases, are based on identification, which frankly can be faulty with catastrophic consequences.
There's a wonderful book called Convicting the Innocent, which took the first 250 DNA exonerations. So with them, there's no question the person was innocent. They had been exonerated by being proven not to have been the perpetrator through DNA evidence. And in most of the most prevalent error was an error of eyewitness identification, often in stranger rape cases.
Okay. Let's take a break. We're about halfway into the program. To let you know that you're watching You and the Law. We're talking about the impact of federal law and due process on society in general. And we have two splendid, I haven't used the word splendid in a long time, splendid, outstanding, probably the best guests. Well, I can't even say that because my other guests will then think they weren't so great. But just fantastic. The Honorable Walter H. Rice and the Honorable Michael R. Merz from the federal court, who, if I said they were my mentors, I don't know if they would agree with that, but I think of it that way. So
I would be flattered.
Well, then there you go. I'd be just like our president. No, ours is more sincere. So anyway, we come to you through the support of the Dayton Bar Association, which has been in existence since 1883, and we weren't around then, but The mayor then was John Miller, and city solicitor was A.W. Cumler, and I think his name's on one of our buildings downtown. And our president was Chester A. Arthur, who came to power through the assassination of Garfield, having been the Port Authority director before that in New York, and was in charge of immigration, so maybe we're coming full circle on that type of thing. But anyway, the Bar Association has services for you, the viewing public, lawyer referral service and for assistance in locating a lawyer if you're a first-timer and you don't know any and nobody can tell you who's the best or whatever. Call down to the Bar Association at 222-6102. We have a notary public service. If you want to become a notary, your company requires you to be that. You want to notarize things in the neighborhood, whatever. There's applications and testing at the Bar Association. Give them a call, 222-7902. A very important program is our Wills for Heroes program, where volunteer members create wills for emergency first responders, firefighters, police, EMTs. So if you fall into that category, and I don't recall when ours is the next time, in May or June, but they have them every month. If you don't have a will, you fall into that category, do it. You'll thank yourself. We have public service committees, community service projects, volunteer speakers for your service clubs. Call down and tell them what you want to hear about, and they will find somebody to talk to you about it. Our website is www.daybar.org, and you can find out, see if I'm right on half the stuff I'm saying here, and more. There's more things than I'm talking about. And as I told you, Bill Wheeler is our director down there. He's done an outstanding job for a number of years since replacing Sharon Cowley a long time ago, who replaced, what was it, Sharon Duffy, I think, way back when we first started doing these things. Anyway, enough about the Bar Association, but it's great. It's serving the community and our members. So,
I want to, if I can, give
Sure.
a shout out to Bill Wheeler's spouse, who just retired this weekend from many years of counseling work at Chaminade-Julienne. Been there. She came there from Julienne when the two schools combined back in the late 60s.
that's great.
Yep, Charlene.
That's great.
Did not know that.
So, okay, so you're watching You and the Law. Our number here is 223-5311. Maybe they can put that in front of my face there, and you'll see what the number is. We're not just talking about the death penalty. We're talking about other things. If you want to talk about, say, separation of powers or reentry programs or things like that, Judge Rice and Judge Merz will be glad to talk about just about anything, because they know all about this. And you'll find out only by calling in and asking more probably probing questions than I've asked so far.
Could you define anything?
Well, we don't know until they call.
That's true. That's true.
If we fall short, I'd be surprised. Let's say it that way. So 223-5311. One of the things that we talked about before the program was the role of the judiciary in rehabilitation of convicted criminals through reentry programs and programs within, I think we even have a rehab court or whatever, and it's not just people go, they serve their time, they get out, and they're thrown to the wind. We're actually doing something about it. The judiciary and the courts are doing something about it, not me personally, although I do my best. So What have we got involved in that?
Well, I think there's a growing belief, Michael, that judges have a responsibility beyond hearing cases and sentencing people. I think we have a responsibility to the people we sentence to help them adjust, reintegrate into the community when they come home from prison. I think we have a responsibility to the community to try to help those returning citizens as well. And as a result, more and more of us are becoming active in reentry work in federal court. We have a reentry court that on a yearly basis works with anywhere from 8 to 12 moderate to high risk offenders, moderate to high risk of recidivism. We work with them, we provide them access to necessary services, whether it's mental health, drug counseling, employment services, housing services, and the like, not to give things away, but to help people who genuinely want to help themselves. I could talk far into your show in September about the obstacles and barriers that returning citizens face.
Well, let me ask this, and not to interrupt, but is this part of like their parole or post-relief release control, or is this something that is offered and they can avail themselves of this?
The latter.
Okay.
It's not compulsory. If they
Which might be better, huh? You're not forcing them to do it?
I think it is. I think it is because they have some stake in the game. And I simply want to emphasize that we are helping people who want to help themselves. We're not forcing services on people who are indifferent about them. Beyond reentry court, in federal court, we have a Restored Citizens Safe Haven Summit that meets monthly at a local church and basically takes reentry court into the entire neighborhood, serving not only federal parolees, but those who have gone through the state criminal justice system as well. Pardon me, and again, if people want services like, how do I get my driver's license back? Is there any way I can be put on a payment plan for my child support so I can afford to take a job without child support consuming 70, 80, or 90% of my salary? Not to evade child support, but to make it more reasonable and capable of being paid. We link people with employers. We help people obtain housing, mental health counseling, family counseling, and the like, not only in reentry court, but in the Restored Citizens Safe Haven Summit. And judges, state and federal, have been instrumental in getting up and running the Montgomery County Office of Ex-Offender Reentry, where again, those services are linked to people who want them. The Reentry Office has initiated a 3-week, 27-hour program on called the Restored Citizens Reentry Career Alliance Academy that basically teaches soft skills, how to prepare yourself for employment, how to dress, how to present yourself. And if a person graduates from that academy and is drug-free, that person will be recommended for employment to any one of the 20-plus employers who have indicated they would accept ex-offenders if recommended by us. And I don't want to forget the state courts, because the Common Pleas Court here in this community, under the leadership of Barbara Gorman and many others, have done absolutely marvelous things for people coming home from state prison, or people who are on parole, people who may not have gone to prison but are supervised on probation. So it is a growing trend. It's a growing trend because it's, we feel, the right thing to do. America is a land of second chances, and you're dealing with people coming home from prison, most of whom are not bad people. They're decent people who have gone down the wrong path and knowingly and intentionally done some bad things. They deserve a chance to be defined not by their past, but by their present potential and future. Secondly, it's a way of saving much money from the criminal justice budget, which is becoming the tail that wags the dog in this and every other community. And lastly, it's the best public safety measure ever to come down the pike in all the years I've been practicing, because hypothetically, if you are helped to help yourself reintegrate into the community, you're raising your family, you're a role model for your children, for your neighborhood, you're a tax-paying citizen who works every day, you're not out and about doing those things that got you in trouble in the first instance.
I think the answer to my next question is probably self-evident, but do you think, both of you, that people who get involved in the criminal justice system are not necessarily criminals, but lack education and basic skills in the things you were talking about, and maybe committing crimes is easier than figuring out how to do a resume to get a job, or finding out who to call, or how to appear, or whatever?
My answer to that is an emphatic absolutely. In other words, yes. If you've grown up without a male role model, as so many people, white and black and Hispanic, are doing today, I learned to do some of these things, not because my father lectured me, but because I watched him do these things. I watched him go to work every day. I watched him contribute to the community. I watched him be kind to my mother and my siblings. If you don't have that, Michael, you can't get it by osmosis unless you're lucky enough to find a male role model outside of your family. So if you don't know how to do the things that many of us take for granted, if you've never learned them by observation, why should we be surprised if people go down the wrong road? Not because they're bad people, but because they simply have never learned how to do things differently. Please comment on
Well, I would emphasize your last point first. It's the best way to prevent recidivism. People who are released from prison go back to the communities that they were sentenced from. So to have the notion that we can put people in prison and forget about them doesn't work. The second point that I would say amen to is about the soft skills. People who don't know how to write a resume, don't know how to present themselves for a job, and by the way, may have a serious drug problem with an underlying mental health problem. Being poor in America is no easy thing, and getting out of it is something that we all need to contribute to. I happen to believe that the best contribution to that is to be involved with community efforts. The Restored Citizens Safe Haven Summit is a fine example of that. I'm involved with an organization in East Dayton that is focused on raising kids in a supportive community and in healthy families. So a 2-generation or 3-generation model of eliminating poverty by encouraging and teaching those skills up front when we can.
I think that's what's beautiful about that program, is it realizes that yes, you have to work with the children, but you only have the children 6-8 hours a day. They go home to the neighborhoods, maybe the same dysfunctional families that they left that very morning, And if you don't address poverty, which is like a quicksand, it just pulls people down, it's impossible to scramble out of. If you don't work on a multi-generational approach, the kids are not doomed, but the kids are certainly disadvantaged vis-a-vis your children, my children, and our grandchildren.
Okay. We're rapidly closing on the end of the program. I did want to talk about one thing which is prevalent in our society today, and of course our guests, you all represent one branch of our equal branches of government, the judiciary. And I wanted to ask you about how you feel, and how does the judiciary feel about the co-equal branches, and whether that's eroding through commentary of maybe not necessarily the administration, but the administration, media today. Commentary on which seems to be, I guess for want of a better term, out of bounds to me.
Well, let me address that, then I want to give Judge Merz a chance to. Then I'd like about 30 seconds on the heroin epidemic.
Okay.
I think what's being done today is unconscionable. It's unconscionable because law and the legal process has been made to seem like a form of entertainment by the media, particularly by television. And these lawyer and judge shows, these crime shows you watch are about as realistic as some utopian society that you may have read of in the mid-19th century. The separation of powers is absolutely critical. It's the one thing that provides stability to our society and to the rule of law in this country, which distinguishes us from so many other countries in the world. It prevents an overbearing executive. It prevents a Congress which has lost its way from doing untold damage to this country. And if people, whether they're in the executive branch or the legislative branch, disagree with one of our decisions, as they have a perfect right to do so, they're welcome to say, we disagree, we're going to appeal the case. But to say that a so-called judge decided this, or that this judge of Mexican heritage can't be impartial because after all, this case he's hearing might impact Mexico. To say that the dumbest kid in a senior year in high school would have seen the legal issue that the judge missed is wrong, because it erodes the respect that people have for the rule of law. And once that reaches a tipping point, we're on a slippery slope from which we will never, ever recover. I could go on, but I hope I've expressed myself clearly.
Judge Merz, anything to? Yes, I agree.
The night he lost in the Supreme Court, Al Gore, to my mind, did exactly the right thing. He said, I disagree, he said. I disagree strongly with what the Supreme Court just did, but the Supreme Court's the Supreme Court. And the rule of law requires that we obey that final decision. Think of the chaos. Think of the chaos that could have been caused in this country if Gore had said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, we won this election and we're going to fight.
Or that would have occurred in most countries of the world where they would have taken that decision and fought it out in the streets. Right. I couldn't agree more.
Perfectly succinct, and exemplifies what happened 60 years ago when President Eisenhower had the first Law Day. And today, of course, is Law Day. I know our program is seen by tape delay a lot, but on today, it's May 1st. It's Law Day. The rule of law is lauded, and of course, is great having you here telling us that. That was succinctly put, Judge. And now I'm going to turn to you and if you want to talk about the heroin and opiates.
Very briefly, it comes as no news that we are in the midst of a heroin overdose epidemic. One of the many reasons is that we are at the crossroads of America, the junction of Interstate 70 and 75, and any drugs that are imported, brought in from Mexico, and then shipped from the southwest to the east coast seem to go through our community. But we are fighting this epidemic, in my opinion, sincerely and with great dedication, but with 1.5 hands tied behind our back, because we are focusing on the 10% of the iceberg that shows above the surface, and that is the physical craving, the addiction, the physical addiction. And we are ignoring the 90% of the iceberg that you can't see, which is the mental health component of addiction. And unless we focus far, far, far more intensely on the mental health component of addiction, we're fighting a losing battle. And this is particularly critical today, Michael, because we're dealing not only with heroin, we're dealing with the heroin additives that expand the amount of heroin that the dealers can sell to addicts on the street. Many of these additives, fentanyl, carfentanil, acrofentanil, are instantly deadly. And that's what's causing the incredible amount of overdoses and deaths. Again, you can physically wean somebody from a controlled substance, but if you don't deal with the underlying mental health issues, that person, unless they are very, very fortunate, are going to relapse.
Are we thinking that the mental health is the cause or the result of the drug use? And another component of this seems to be that it's across the entire spectrum of the population. It isn't just criminals, down and out people. It seems like it's touching every part of society.
Amen.
Well, I would say amen as well. The answer to your first question, does mental health cause the addiction or is it vice versa? It's a chicken or egg argument. I can mount arguments on both sides of that question. Secondly, the addiction now is spreading to the point where it knows no racial, gender, socioeconomic boundaries. It is literally everywhere. With every race, religion, socioeconomic stratum, and the like.
Part of the problem is in dealing with the moment of intervention when somebody has an overdose and the emergency medical folks or the police are able to bring them back with Narcan. Part of the problem is we've got no place for those people to do something on day two. There's an enormous concentration of addicted people in the jail. The emergency room doctors will tell you they throw their hands up because they've got no place to send people when except to send them back into the environment that caused the problem in the first place. So we need expanded treatment modalities and facilities in this town to deal after somebody's been brought back with Narcan.
Boy, that's so true. And I don't want to infer or give the impression that our mental health facilities and mental health providers are poor. The quality is excellent. The quantity is absolutely abysmal. And we simply must, as a community, demand that the mental health component be, frankly, more focused on than I believe it is. Than I believe is happening.
Do you think this has taken the medical society by surprise, the enormity of it, Or did they see it coming and just said, well, everybody can take care of themselves?
I've not heard any doctor say they saw it coming. I think, part of the reason for the spread across the socioeconomic strata is that doctors got in, lured by the drug companies. Doctors got into making sure people got their pain treated, and then when the doc tries to take you off of the pain meds, but you're already hooked, heroin is a cheaper substitute for the prescription opioids.
I agree with Judge Merz. Many people who graduate to heroin or likely similar controlled substances have started by becoming addicted to pain medication, which I believe, frankly, is too readily available. But to say we as a society didn't see this coming is balderdash, and I'll tell you why. Because 30 years ago, we had a crack cocaine epidemic in this community that, while it didn't cause as many deaths from overdose, ran rampant for a number of years. And to have forgotten that bit of our history has indeed condemned us to repeat it.
Okay, I'm gonna have to cut you off. Our floor director tells us we're out of time. We appreciate you coming. Judge Rice, Judge Merz, you've provided a standard of legal excellence for many, many years and exhibited here today, and we thank you. It's been a production of You and the Law. I want to thank all the volunteers behind the scenes who have made this program possible. Again, thanking our guests, the Honorable Walter H. Rice and the Honorable Michael R. Merz. I've been your producer and host. I'm Mike Monta. Thank you for joining us on You and the Law. We'll see you again, and a special good night to Katie, Lily, and Everett. See you again. Good night.